Sta arrivando?
Sì, lo vedo che sì.
Great. Oh, he's backstage. Oh,
hello.
I'm here.
There you are. Glen, it is a real pleasure to meet you.
Thank you.
Hello. We have mutual friends with John. So I just wanted to know John Foley has spoken so highly of you. So I'm truly honored. But Ludovico, take over, babe. It's yours.
Good evening, Glen. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really, really happy to have you here. We've already been live for a few minutes, so I've already introduced you in Italian, so I don't have to repeat that again, and we can actually focus on the question because we want to get as much knowledge from you. You have such a deep and detailed understanding of the subject. And I'll try to keep our questions as concise as they can, so you speak most of the time. So the first subject I would like to touch is the Ukrainian army from 2014 to today. What would you say are the key points in order to understand what changes and what reforms the army has gone through? And what would you say are the consequences and the impacts of that on what's happening today on the battlefield?
Okay. Well, I think you need to jump back a bit before 2014, because of course it wasn't an army before 2014. In the previous regime, they ripped apart everything that had been happening. So, but 2008, 2009, 2010, Ukraine was quite steadily going towards NATO membership. And there were a lot of good changes. There were changes to the system, changes to the structure, ways of working, and there were the green shoots of a new culture. And then that all got ripped apart in sort of 12, 13 by the previous regime, who sold off loads of the equipment, ripped out units, reduced the size of the organization, and dysfunctionalized the system. And what do I mean by dysfunctionalized? Well, they took away things that were important, like the military police. They created rules, regulations, and procedures that contradicted each other. The soldier's handbook was just so thick that it was actually unreadable. They added things like actions in the cookhouse. So you got several pages of how you behaved in the cookhouse, all of which were of course completely contradictory as well, which meant that basically a soldier could be punished for anything and that whatever you did was wrong. Now this had a huge effect because after the changes in 2014, nobody changed those rules and regulations. Nobody changed how to work in the cookhouse. Nobody changed how to do procurement, which had been completely messed up. So during the sort of the Poroshenko era, it was quite easy for government to fix contracts. It was quite easy because the system was so complex for people to get their friends to do the work on housing. So they would get kickbacks, and it was easy to do this because the system was so Byzantine that everybody was too busy trying to stand on their feet to actually to look at anything. So there was no 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. There was really no governance because nobody could govern, and those deputy ministers that were there, if they were honest, they were stuck because of the mess, and if they were dishonest, they were enjoying themselves taking money. So the reform during that period was really almost nothing. Then I would say round about 16, UK and US started getting serious, and And even that failed because, for example, the Ministry of Defense in Ukraine didn't allocate the right amount of money for things. So, for example, the Americans helped them build the training area at Yavri, but they didn't build because they couldn't, because the American money is as American money is allowed to be used. The Ukrainians didn't build any houses for instructors or their families. So when they said, okay, we need instructors, then nobody's going to go, because they're not going to go and, wait for it, live in a tent and then train soldiers. So they couldn't get any instructors to go. Things like this were just commonplace. I mean, that's just one example. The expansion of the army meant that they produced these new brigades, but there were no barracks for the new brigades. So they literally, when they came back from the war, the ATO as it was called, the terrorist training, the terrorist area, when they came back from there, they had to live on training camps in tents, which were often like 30 centimeters in water, and a complete and utter disaster for the soldiers.
Yeah.
So at the time when we're trying to create new enthusiastic soldiers, the system is working against creating new enthusiastic soldiers. Now, the public got involved in, I can't remember, 16, I think, or 15 quite seriously, by creating what's known as the Reform Office in the Ministry of Defense. And the Reform Office, I mean, they basically had to start with fundamentals. And when I say fundamentals, I mean fundamentals like uniform, actually a proper uniform for the soldiers, because previously they didn't really have proper uniform. It was just, let's buy this, let's buy that sort of thing. So I actually went to the first meeting, the first uniform meeting, which was run by a member of the Reform Office. And we had a Ukrainian army officer there who was at best partially interested, and myself and a guy called Vlad Malensky, who is one of the best reform specialists with knowledge of culture, but had been in the Bulgarian Armed Forces as a colonel. So Vlad actually knew about the uniform as well. And we did this meeting explaining what is uniform to these two, socks, underpants, webbing, etc., 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 flak jacket, helmet, beret, and it went on. So they laid out the detail for this. Now, this was the first glimmering of reform. Now, that's about late 15, early 16. They also tried to reform fuel. And I came in 16 to try and reform housing. A complete disaster. I mean, I failed. I was there for 18 months and failed, but managed at least to hand over my knowledge to volunteers, civilians, who then kept the pressure on the system, who are still keeping the pressure on the system because it is still not fixed. There's still sort of illegalities in this. Anyway, so we grow. The training starts. Finally, they build houses. They get people into Yavri. Britain comes in, starts to work with the army, realizes that it's not working particularly well, moved to the Navy, because the Navy was a bit more, as we say in English, forward-leaning than the army. And there is a gradual improvement in the tactical level knowledge of the soldiers. But let's go through the big buts, and there are several of them. Everything done by the Americans and the British was outside of the system. So separate, not part of the training for war, but outside of it. So if people went on it, then it was a luxury rather than a necessity before you went on to the ATO. Now, gradually that changed, like 18, 19, and they started to try and get it into training for the ATO, but it didn't always work. Yavri, which is where the Americans were, the Americans wanted to train a battalion. Great idea, except that conceptually, a battalion in the West is totally different from a battalion in Ukraine. So to create a battalion for Yavri, they had to take the soldiers from 3 battalions in Ukraine, much smaller, to make one for Yavri. Problem, you don't need 3 lots of officers. So you're only training 1 lot of officers, but 3 lots of soldiers. So the officers who don't get trained, are disgruntled because they're not being trained, and B, something you wouldn't normally think of, which is their soldiers then don't respect them because the officers don't know as much as the soldiers, and because they're not good enough to train. They're not good enough to train their own soldiers. Ergo, they're not good enough to be officers. So we were actually creating internal dynamics that the unexpected consequences of these things.
Yeah.
And we didn't train that proper level of officer that you need to train, which is the commanding officers, the lieutenant colonels, and the brigadiers. So they were still working on Soviet doctrine, whilst the boys at the bottom had been trained on Western doctrine. So as soon as the boys got back to the brigade, boys and girls, let's be unsexist about this. As soon as the boys and girls got back to the brigade, they were told, oh, it's all right learning that with them, but they're not at war like us. You stick to our doctrine. So there were lots of challenges crept in. And what started to happen was that the brightest and best started leaving because they did not wish to work with officers that knew less than they did or who would not let them do their job. So, for example, one of the sergeants I knew who went to America, did the sergeant's major's course, very sharp man, came back, wasn't allowed to do his job properly, was still treated, because you have to remember, a sergeant in conscript times is a senior conscript. So he's a man with 1 year's experience. A sergeant in Britain or America, or Britain, for example, he's not going to be a sergeant before he's been in 9 years. If he is, he's rather sharp. It may be, people do get it in 5.
Right.
But it's unusual. So the Soviets still see sergeants as the British would see a lance corporal, i.e. person with 1 tape on their arm. And that's a fundamental difference in what you expect, what you demand, and when someone turns around and tells you as an officer, Ukrainian army, and the sergeant turns around and tells you that's not the way we should do it, sir, the sergeant gets or was getting smacked because we didn't at the time train the lieutenant colonels and the colonels about what is a sergeant. So we were training sergeants in what you have to be, but we weren't training the system in how to deal with these new people. So we were setting up all these tensions internally without really understanding what we were doing at the time in setting them up. So yes, reform is taking place, but it's taking place not in a smooth fashion and under a lot of stress.
Okay.
So, go on, ask a question.
Yeah. No, Glenn. So what you're describing basically is the heritage that, let's say, the Ukrainian army got from the Soviet. It's a completely different mindset. It's a completely different way. So they, So this is right. This is what you're describing basically is that they had to switch from the Soviet way, right, and the Soviet system into another. Right, another.
I wrote to Poroshenko as the president in back end of 2017. I wrote a paper called "How to Defeat Putin," basically, and Poroshenko put it in the bin. And then the defense minister attacked me and said I didn't know what I was talking about. I wasn't an advisor. A couple of people sent him the picture of him with me in his office, which was still on the Ministry of Defense website. So that rather scotched that idea. But that was then public.
Even after 2014, they weren't accepting these changes. I mean,
no. They were making money from it.
I see.
Well, they're making money. Why?
Oh.
And they never thought that it was going to go any further. Or, sorry, either they didn't think it was going to go any further, or there was an arrangement between Putin and Poroshenko or others,
right,
other oligarchs, that we make lots of money out of this.
Okay.
So there were things being bought, like ships being made for the Navy, which were totally just rubbish, and not useful in the slightest. And so 3 or 4 ships laid down that you couldn't use, and renovation of old ships so shipyards were getting, Poroshenko's friends and Poroshenko were getting these deals. And also, ambulances made that were completely unsuitable for the terrain, because they just didn't have the height that you need to go into the front line, because you can't have something that's too low. You need a 4x4 framework structure, the Land Rover type things, because the potholes just from the mortar and artillery rounds on the roads and in the ground. So if you're too low, you break the axle underneath. So there were loads of those bought, and other things, and mortars that didn't work because the metal was low quality,
right,
etc.
Yeah.
So here we are. We come to 18, and I'm going to say after my letter, there was a massive upsurge of civil society. I had 2,000 friend requests on Facebook in one weekend. Just think about that, which I tried to answer all of them, which took me a couple of weeks. And basically, a lot of those people who just said, we didn't know. Well, of course, they didn't know, because until 18, Poroshenko was saying we've got the best army in Europe, publicly, all the time. And so people thought the army was great. But at the front line, I mean, some of the trenches were just, I visited in 2017, and, rubbish all around the place, not properly equipped, no proper toilets, nowhere to properly, they had to dig their own sleeping place. Basically, you could almost say abandoned. So it wasn't the best army in Europe. What was there was super what's the word I'm looking for? Superhuman people. The basic quality of the people was good. They just needed looking after, and they needed developing, and they needed proper training. And then, so coming out of 18, 19, as the public jumped on everything a bit more. They jumped on the housing, they jumped on training, they jumped on those training areas with tents. I mean, really real abuse. And it was on television and everything else. Then gradually the quality of things changed. People started going on NATO exercises, and uniform became more common everywhere. And basically lots of things came, but there were still remaining problems with procurement. The procurement law got changed. This must be 19 or 20, just coming into COVID time. And then another minister, the Taran, the last but one defense minister. No, the last defense. He was last defense minister. He cut the reform office. Got rid of all the people. And at that point, then the reform of the procurement system into competition and proper open purchasing of things almost stopped dead. So in 20 and 21, here we are coming into a wartime. They're hardly spending the defense money properly. So there were coming into the war, there were massive shortages of things like fuel. During that period, 17, 18, 19, there were also all these ammunition explosions at the ammunition depots, and none of that was replaced. So even now, going into the war, Ukraine does not have its own proper ammunition plant. So during all that time, 8 years, no ammunition plant, despite the fact that more ammunition was lost in those fires and attacks by Russia than was lost than was lost in the during the 8 years of fighting. So you could say, but when the war started, there were a lot of loose ends, but the quality of the people was class. So if you sit, and lots of the soldiers who went away as the war started, now lots of them came back. Now, lots didn't, because lots went into the territorial defense because they didn't want to go back into the army necessarily straight army, because of still the leadership in some places was not sparkling. It's a very what's the word, curate's egg sort of thing. Some brigades are brilliant, some brigades were still pretty Soviet, and almost still are.
Yeah. So Glen, I guess this is the reason why so many people, because I had read quite a bit, in 2020 into 2021, especially around, I would say, last April, where so many analysts, at least the people that, I was reading, said that, if there were to be some sort of full-on attack, on different, that the Ukrainian army would simply just fold in very, very little time. Can you explain then, from what you're saying, there were deficiencies, and it's basically the personnel, the soldiers themselves, who are top notch and everything. So how did they, in so little time, how did they manage to fend off the Russian forces? Was it their
two sides to this? Let's talk about Ukrainians first.
Okay.
Well, as I said, they're good people. You have to remember that culturally, is it culturally or humanly, that a lot of the Ukrainians are of that technical characteristic. So they've got the sort of the surgeon, the mechanic, the doctor's type brains, and therefore they're very good with technical things.
The great programmers, for example.
Yeah, programmers. That's why you got so many programmers. So picking up new weapons and things like this is actually not a problem for them. They've got that sort of brain, and so there's lots of them like that. So the soldiers make do very, very well, and always made do very well, despite whatever anybody did to them. Also, you've got to remember that they were fighting for Ukraine. So for 8 years they've been there. So anybody who gets a contract to go into the army knows that he's at risk of dying. But fighting for Ukraine is more important than dying. And therefore, the people who were looking at them that time, they were taking the technical things in the Western view, not the cultural things in the Ukrainian view. So the value, and also there's quite a lot more older soldiers in the Ukrainian armed forces and in the reserves. So those reserves who came in, remember that a lot of those reserves are business people. They're programmers. They're everything. I mean, a friend of mine, she's in the front, going to the front line now from being a reservist. She's a doctor, but she's going to go and carry a rifle. So she's actually quite sharp. And you got people like that. So if you take, despite all the bad things, a really good chunk of experience from 8 years of war, plus the NATO training, those who've been, not everybody's been, plus lots of medical training. So there's been a professionalism underpinning this all the time. So you've got, and also at the officer level, people, a lot of the middle rank officers viewing how British officers, Canadian officers, and American officers deal with their soldiers. And that more equal relationship, that it's not one above the other. It's there's the equality, and so they've seen that and got a chance to feel that themselves. So you had that. You've got this maturity, as I said. You've got this technical competence. You've got the war experience, and you've got the morale and motivation. And when you put those four together, it's a monstrous strength,
formidable force.
It's a formidable force, and that's so that on our side, that's what you've got. And it's almost mentally unbreakable when you've got that. So what we got on the other side, we need to talk about Russia to understand this. Okay, so Russia really is still Soviet. Totally. They haven't changed at all, not even a tiny bit. So you've got huge corruption on the Russian side. You've got an organization that thrives and lives on lies, dishonesty, and mistrust, which is why the generals have been killed, because the generals have to go forward because they don't trust a lieutenant colonel to tell them what's happening.
Yeah.
And the lieutenant colonel is only going to lie anyway.
Yeah.
Because you have to remember this great line that which is Soviet, which is, it is not a lie to tell someone what they want to hear.
Right.
So you have to understand that.
No. You know what you're saying, Glenn? I had a really great conversation with Paul Eaton, who's retired general himself.
Yeah.
And he was saying exactly what you're saying. He put a lot of emphasis on the morale and the spirit, the esprit de corps, in the sense that, like having a mission, having a reason to fight, he said, which is
everything.
Totally missing, on the Russian side.
The Russians haven't got that, and they don't do any training. Remember, the Russians don't exercise as we exercise in the West. They follow a script. So remember that, a script is like Romeo and Juliet. So you only learn Romeo and Juliet. You don't learn Much Ado About Nothing. You only learn Romeo and Juliet, and you get
There's
really
no flexibility. Absolutely no flexibility.
So when this is why they had that 40-kilometer long convoy, or 60 if you're someone else, but 40-kilometer long, because they had to keep going down the same road. It's how down in the south near Kherson, they 10 times the headquarters stopped on the same airfield. 10 times. And each time the Ukrainian artillery killed people. Each time they took out.
Right.
Yeah, they kept pouring in, basically.
Yeah, because they have to.
Let's see if it doesn't work the first time. Let's see if it works the 10th.
You got this road. To here. And this is where you put the headquarters. So they did that each time. And
right.
And it's beyond the belief of the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
I mean, when it got to the third time, the Ukrainians were actually laughing about it.
Wow.
When it got to the fifth or sixth, you could almost feel the point of sadness.
Yeah.
You could actually hear the sadness read the sadness in the comments.
Yeah, they're just
sadness and glee. Sadness and glee on one side, that they're so totally stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing is you look at the Ukrainians when you see the pictures of them, they look strong physically. They look like men. There, when you look at the pictures of the Russians, then they look like little boys who are alcoholics and who are not really ready for. They're not ready for war in any way, shape, or form. And of course, many of them, not only were they not ready for war, but weren't even properly told they were going to war until until the day before they were told, you either go home and go to prison, or you sign this piece of paper and you cross the border.
Yeah,
I mean, there are other gems from the Russian side. One of which was that they were the boys who were living up in the north, in Belarusia, that they came across with dried rations, ration packs dated "Eat by 2015." So, as you can imagine, what the quality of those were like. And not enough of them to go to war.
Yeah.
Not enough.
So the Russians were not taking care. The Russian forces not taking care of their own soldiers, and this has a huge impact.
At all.
Huge impact.
Yeah, of course. At all. I mean, they were just left them there to get cold and wet during November and December, and it was -10. In January. When they did in February when they did the attack. I mean, that first week round Kharkiv, I mean, it was -12, -14. So if you're outside without proper equipment, without proper clothing, which they didn't have, then a lot of those soldiers got frostbite. The Russian soldiers, and you know, that's not funny.
No.
So the Russian side was frankly in a mess. I think that's about the best way of putting it. And you know, one of my analyst colleagues, he said, well, you've got, you know, this caucus of Ukrainians who really want to fight, who are experienced, mature, with common sense about what they're doing, against a mob. Just
Indeed.
the mob.
Yeah. Marauders.
Yeah. Who are coming, who are literally coming to steal,
whatever they could,
to kill, to rape, to get, you know, marauders. I mean, it's a horde.
Yeah,
it's a horde. It's a middle-aged horde.
Yeah.
Not an army in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
Now here we are at the stage of, do we know how they're going to fight in the east? Well, a lot of them will still be a horde, but you know, new generals, new emphasis, much more much more narrow focus on the battlefield of where they're going to fight, and with probably they will try and actually make sure that the people have got fuel.
I got a question when you're finished your thought.
Yeah,
I have a question.
And so that the attack could be completely different, but it's still going to be the same people on the other side.
Yeah,
and it's still going to be the same Ukrainians on this side. So you know, it will come down to the robustness and strength of mind of the Ukrainians, despite everything, and despite how many of them get killed by our longer range artillery and everything else, versus the horde. And it depends how many people they put in the horde, how narrow they put them, and how hard they push them. And I don't know that side at all. I don't know what they'll do yet. And well, nobody does, not even the Ukrainians. So we're waiting for the next few days, maybe a week, before the horde starts, to see what the focus is, and whether they'll try a pincer movement round the back of the old trench lines, or whether they'll try and break through the trench lines, which is what they've been trying to do solidly since the war started, and basically broke out to the north, because in the north, the brigades that were there were very, very thinly spaced. It was more patrolling by the Ukrainians across the sort of the steppes, as you know, the great Ukrainian steppes. It was more small outposts and going there and looking than it was dug in trenches like down the south towards Mariupol, or towards in front of Donetsk and in front of Luhansk. So we wait and see.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're all looking on. Do you think, Glenn, that the Russians have solved their logistical problems? I was taught at university that, it's logistics.
Yeah.
All right. Do you think that they have solved these problems, or we'll see whether they've solved them or not?
No, I think we'll see whether they've solved them. I mean, the challenge, the challenge was, and I jumped to another subject, but it's still part of it, which was that when the Russians came forward, and what they've been doing is creating these, what they call battalion groups, battalion task groups. Now, the doctrinal logic of a battalion task group is that it should be self-contained. In other words, it should be able to manage itself. And part of that is that you have your own artillery. Part of that is you have your own ammunition and your own fuel. But nobody told the general staff that the doctrine of task groups needs to be done differently. So the artillery commander wanted to keep his artillery to himself, not hand it out to a battalion commander. And I don't think that battalion commanders were taught how to use the artillery in these circumstances. They moved forward without enough fuel, so they weren't carrying fuel to drive. Now, had they had the fuel, it would have been a different war, because down south, when they actually came out of Crimea, if they'd have been front-loaded with fuel, then a couple of those battalion groups would have scythed a long, long way north, all the way to Dnieper and maybe even past Dnieper, not where they stopped because they ran out of fuel where they were. So, I mean, remember that it's, with a tank, it's not miles to the gallon, it's gallons to the mile. And so if you've got a tank battalion that's independent, you've got to give it a shed load of fuel. And you can't, and what the logistic officers were doing. So chief of logistic was centralizing his fuel. So then the fuel was coming up in trains of fuel, which makes for one big target, and you've got to wait till it gets to you. And this is how they mess it up. So doctrinally, the battalion group concept, wonderful if they'd let it work, but they didn't actually change the written doctrine, I don't think. So people that the big boys, the generals and artillery commanders and logistic commanders, were still trying to do it the old way, where you have a division and brigades, not these free-thinking battalions. And of course, if you've got a top-down army, you don't have free-thinking battalions either, because they're not allowed to, because they can't make a mistake. So, and they can only follow the script. So everything was contraindicative. They fought against themselves at the time with what they were doing. Now, whether they now understand this, I don't think so. I don't think they will. I think all they'll do is they'll drop back to the old doctrine, which is use artillery en masse, try and kill as many people as possible, and then attack with tanks when it's all broken, is my view.
Which is what? Chechnya, it's Syria.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the old, right?
It's the old Soviet way of doing business. You could say tried and tested. I mean, it has worked in the past.
Well, they didn't have, let's say, in Chechnya and also in Syria, they didn't have any pushback either from a trained
from anybody. And the quality, but the quality of manpower now is not a quality of manpower to allow you to do rampaging attacks. You've got to be good to do things like that. You've got to be experienced. You've got to be skilled. I mean, before he went to the Gulf War, H. Jones, who got the Victoria Cross, sorry, not Gulf War, Falklands War. Before he went to the Falklands War and got killed, H. Jones, the commanding officer of 2 Para, was in a conference where I was sitting, and he said, "I am now clear that when you've got a battalion together, it takes 4 years to get it to operational effectiveness." So here we are with groups of conscripts. Yeah. So, there's just not the slightest chance.
Like maybe 3 months of training if they got it.
No, none.
Zero.
Zero. Because the training is done. The training is done in the battalion. So who's going to do the training? You want the commanding officer to do the training. He's not going to go to war with these guys, is he?
Right.
Oh dear. Yes, he is. But he doesn't know that. So he gets all these guys. What are we going to do with them? Well, we do anything. We bully them. We dig gardens. We paint stones. Yeah. But we're not going to do training because we probably haven't got any ammunition. We probably haven't got any fuel.
Wow.
Oh, no, sorry. The fuel's been sold. We had got fuel, it's been sold. So we've made money from selling the fuel.
Yeah.
And so anything. Yeah. So you don't train the conscripts because you no need to. They're going to leave. Why do you bother training someone who's going to leave? And then you get some more. So the officers in a conscript organization become school teachers. Now, if they're honest school teachers like the Finns, they do their absolute best to get everybody to the right quality. If they're dishonest, corrupt school teachers, as in Russia, you don't do anything. You just, as I said, you sell the food, you sell that. You just let the soldiers manage each other, bully each other. Who cares? Yeah. You might teach them enough to drive the vehicle so that when the commander comes and puts you all on the square, or you do lots of marching in some cases, lots of practices for the parade.
Well, they have those that May Day, that
correct. And you can
they bring in all the artillery, all of
and you can see how many hours and hours and hours of practice they've had to do that properly. So Ludovico.
No, it's fine. No, basically, I was trying to say what I wanted to say is it sounds like it's equally a the human capital of the Ukrainian army was underestimated by many. On the other hand, we hugely overestimated the capabilities of the Russian army against a conventional army, not against poorly armed.
And there are reasons for this. I mean, one reason is that the bean counters, as they call them, have been grading armies, and putting them in these lists of biggest army, second biggest army, by virtue of numbers. So 8,000 tanks, making an assumption 8,000 tanks equals 8,000. 8,000 trained tank crews. But nobody. But the Russians, I mean, they put their tanks into store. And 2 weeks ago, when they came to take them out of store, only 1 in 10 was usable.
Exactly.
Because the other people had stolen all the bits from the others.
All the bits and parts. Exactly. Yeah. You know what, Glenn? We had talked at length. Okay. My colleague, Olga Lautman. And I remember we were talking before. And I said, Olga, oh my God, they're going to go, this is an attack around, this was about the first. Well, no, it was just after Zapad. Okay. Yeah. Well, first in April, then after Zapad. And she said, and I said, oh my God, Olga, they're the escalation and this is that and the other. And we were talking about numbers. And she said, don't worry, it's going to be a huge fiasco. She said half of the stuff that they bring to the border is all going to fall apart, basically. Yeah. That they had, as you have said, Glenn, she said they probably sold off all the fuel. She wasn't really, she was worried, obviously. It's not like we were taking this flippantly. We don't do that. But she, based on her analysis and years and years and years of following all the developments in the army, after 2012, they were supposed to do a major reform of the army, but then they got rid of, the minister. And then they put in Shoigu, and Shoigu's a businessman. So, so it was just sort of, as you're saying, all of the, how can I put it? The corruption that is at the top, basically, that trickles down, and she was very
no governance. I mean, people are not looking at the right things. There's no proper checks and balances anywhere across the system because they're all in it.
Yeah.
And where everybody's
something off.
Everybody's making their taking their piece of the pie, and this was the case in Ukraine. Society started squeezing that out in 18.
Right.
Because the majority of Ukrainians are soft and Christian. I mean, they're a different sort of, and don't like theft. So they certainly didn't like it in the armed forces because the armed forces were there to protect them. And there's a when they find out that something is not right, there's a deep unease around the place.
Which kind of leads to something I wanted to ask you, because from reading your articles and your interviews in the past, you've always praised very much the Ukrainian civil society and soldiers, and equally criticized their political and military elite. And I remember how actually critical you were of Zelensky when he came to power, and as many, of course. And one of the criticisms that was moved at him, except from the lack of experience and so on, was that he had selected a very Russian-leaning, Russian-friendly team. Would you say there was a change of tone at some point during his presidency, or because
that is a seriously difficult question to answer. I mean, if there's a change of tone, it was on the second or third day when after the war started, when he realized that he had to be president. But there's still a lot of unease in society about people that he's got in his team, for all sorts of reasons. And I have the same unease, and I've written about it and said so. I mean, at the time when he came in, then he chose Homchak as the chief of defense, and Homchak is he's old school. He's old school, and he's one of these people who's, you know, when he was standing in front of soldiers, you could see the soldiers were uneasy and not happy. You know, they were in the presence of someone who, I'm not going to say didn't like, because he always sort of said he did, but he didn't know how to like them. I think that would be the best way of putting it. He just didn't have it in his skill set to relax in front of soldiers and to be on the same team as them. And you've got to be, with an army, you've got to be, the generals have got to be in the same team. If they're not in the same team, if they don't know people by their nicknames, if they don't have a way of picking out who the best commanding officer is by his ability, not by his ability to make money for you, then you can't produce this system. So Homchak was the wrong person. And when Zaluzhny came in, the new one, I mean, there was a fundamental change in July. I mean, monstrous change. I mean, he's a nice man. He's a nice man. And the soldiers immediately can sense this. I mean, fairly soon after he came in, he ran the Armed Forces 10K with the Armed Forces Sergeant Major. The two of them ran around together with a whole load of people. And, he's got a smile on his face as he's doing it. And that is the sort of thing that soldiers instantly recognize as, the boss is a nice guy. And if the boss is a nice guy, people will die for it. And he brought back in, just by his character, he brought honesty back into the system. And honesty is that you cannot have an armed force that works without honesty and integrity. You've got to have those two things. Honesty, because if you can't say to your boss, hey, my unit can't work. If you can't say, I messed that up, I need to go back and do it again, you can never improve. You can never get to world-class levels. I mean, to a large degree, in a good armed forces, you've got to have the, even right up every rank, you've got to have that sort of athlete-coach relationship where the coach can say, that didn't work. I mean, you don't say, I'm not going to coach you. You don't put someone in prison. You just say, that didn't work. Let's try it again. Or we're going to have to do that another 15 times before it works. And you've got to have that relationship. And Zaluzhny has brought in much more of that relationship where people feel more relaxed about, I won't say necessarily failure, because that takes a lot longer, but they feel a lot happier about not standing to attention and being worried and frightened in front of the boss. And that was only from July. And I shudder to think what would have happened, as you say, last March, because I think it would have been a different army last March.
Yeah.
And a different battle last March from now, after Zaluzhny is 8 months in command. And also the last defense minister, Taran, did not manage the Ministry of Defense at all well. It was a disaster. I mean, he was a general. He wasn't a manager. He got no business experience. And
he was fired in November or something like that, right?
Yeah, in November. And then
he was fired in November.
And then Reznikov, who came in. I mean, he's got a bit more experience because he's a lawyer and he's done a few more things, and he's a bit more open to talking to Zaluzhny in a man-to-man fashion. I mean, the two of them are frequently seen walking, not quite arm in arm, but walking along together, and the body language is good. The body language is leaning in, talking, not the, and those things are vital. So we've been lucky with those changes at the right time.
Yeah, right at the right time.
So you could say that Zelensky got it wrong at first and then got it right the second time. Thankfully.
Yeah, thankfully. Indeed.
Yeah.
Thank goodness. Glenn, can I ask you? Well, how much time have we got? How much can you stay, Glenn?
I can stay to you. I've got another 20 minutes, 30. Then I've got to have a cup of tea before my next one.
Sure, I know. We got hits left, right, and center. I understand.
This is three. This will be three. Which question
today. You want to go with? We can ask a question each.
Yeah, go on.
I mean, actually, I have a question, but I think I'll keep it for the end.
Okay. You can keep your question. I wanted to ask you about NATO. Okay.
Yeah,
This
exactly.
development, Glenn, okay, because you're in the Baltics, right? There's two things. One, the question of Finland and Sweden, okay, that could be, all right. I think Finland has expressed the fact that it wants to get into, right? It will be making an application, putting forward their candidacy for NATO, and also Finland as well. I think that Finland said that they were going to begin the procedure in April, which is now, and then formally, in July in the summer. But that's not the important part. The important part is that I was looking at a map, and basically Helsinki, is right on just the opposite of St. Petersburg. I mean, we're talking about a land border now between Finland and Russia that's 1,340 kilometers. What is your view on, what are the consequences if this does go through? What are the consequences? What are we looking at?
Well, I don't know if you knew, but I was actually British Defence Attaché in Finland.
We did mention it.
We did.
You did mention it. I wrote.
Actually, no, Ludovico told me that. Yeah.
I wrote quite a few things about NATO in those days, and got a lot of flack for it. A lot of quite hard discussion with politicians, including then Terry Hallinan, the president. But it was interesting. But yeah, I mean, the thing about it is, I mean, at the moment, as they stand, Finland is extremely vulnerable. I mean, Russia has done overflights. I mean, about 2 years ago, they flew a couple of attack helicopters deep into Finland, and a few weeks ago, overflew right over the center of Finland a couple of jet aircraft. So Russia feels, as it is at the moment, that they can mess them about and bully them as they want to, which is in effect what they've always done. I mean, they've done it since the Second World War, and you could always sense this. When I was there, you could sense it amongst the diplomats, that there was this feeling of sort of like Russian superiority, which I might add also was exactly the same across the water in Estonia as well. Now, the border is quite interesting because, I mean, it's a long border, but there's only a couple of crossing points in it. Most of it's forest and deep forest. And when I went to visit the border guard on the border up in the middle, and we were talking about this, they said we had 93 crossings last year, and they're all terribly serious. And 93 crossings, and I pressed them for what the 93 crossings were. And the guy said, "All right," he said, "I'll tell you." He said, "Okay. Of the 93 crossings," he said, one was Russian. He was drunk. He got lost. He was a forest worker and he got lost. He said 17 were bears that triggered the alarm. And he said, and all the rest, and he said, you have to believe this, all the rest were wedding couples wanting to take a picture after the wedding inside Russia. Finnish wedding couples. So they cross the border and get the border posts and take their wedding pictures and then come back again. So that was their 93 or 97, 93, I think it was, crossings. So, I mean, it's pretty difficult. So it is to a large degree blockable. And I would assume that if they join, that there will be either American or another country's forces will be stationed around the bloc, in the same way that there's the forward presence in the Baltics.
Okay.
The other thing is, I mean, frankly, if Russia in the condition that it's in at the moment, if it wants to take on Finland as well, then it's foolish. It's foolish. Yeah. I mean, even if they did try to do what they're doing with Ukraine, they would get a really, really bloody nose.
Yeah, that's exactly the question I wanted to ask you. If there is any way that Russia could actually attack a NATO.
Well, no, they could. I mean, they could attack Finland as an independent country, and they could make a real mess of Helsinki and Turku and everywhere else, Lappeenranta and places, just the same way they've done it there. But they would also get a bloody nose from the Finns, because the quality of the armed forces is high, and they've got all the same maturity, morale, and of course, full of people who can start a car in -30, And people like that are really, really good soldiers. They make for good soldiers just from the basics, because they're quite happy living in, challenging conditions. But I mean, one would hope that on joining NATO, then they would then join the untouchables, because it would then, Russia would then be fighting everybody, not just Finland. So as they are at the moment, they're high risk. The same with Sweden, with Gotland, and also Åland Islands, which are only just up the road and quite easy to take, and have got a port there and everything else. So I think that Sweden and Finland are making the right choice, but a bit late. They should have made it 2 years ago.
Yeah, they should have done it a
Should have
long
made
time
it
ago.
2 years ago.
Don't they also?
Because it was obvious Russia was coming. It's been obvious since 2000.
So it was obvious for you. I'm so happy that you said that, Glenn, because there's so many people. Okay, we have to fight. Ludovico and I, and a whole group here with Liberi Oltre, who are fantastic journalists. We have to fight constantly and to make people understand that this was in the cards for quite a long time. How did you come to this? Since Georgia. See?
Yeah. Since Georgia.
There you go. Yeah.
I mean,
2007
I went back to the Ministry of Defence in UK.
Right.
In 2001. I was still in Finland. So 2001, my last year there, and I said we're in trouble. And I said we're in trouble because I was told by the Russian defense attaché, who I got on with really well. Reason why did I get on with as well? Because I used to do biathlon, and his wife was an international biathlete. So she and I used to talk biathlon and go and watch the competitions and things. And he said the general staff are not going to change. The general staff hate the West, and everything that we get from the general staff is hate-filled. And he said that to me in 2001, and I went back and tried to report it, and no one was interested. And I was told I was a Cold War warrior. So I've been looking at it with those eyes since 2001, and nothing that I saw when I was here in Latvia and back, nothing changed that, because you just see the press, the growth of the growth of fake news, the growth of the strategic lines to take from Russians. I mean, as I've been working around Europe in the last 10 years, the same things kept coming up in different places. And not only that, people were saying the same things to me. And then you look at it, and my friend Tom, who's American, and we've been working together, and we'd go back to the hotel in the evening, and he'd look at me and he'd say, "Did you hear it?" And I'd say, "Yeah, I heard it." And he'd say, how could he know that? See, there's this one myth that I was PNG'd from Estonia. And that was a Russian myth. And they told the Finns that I'd been PNG'd from Estonia because I went to visit an Estonian unit without warning. And you don't do that as a defense attaché. What they didn't know was that I was going there on behalf of the Estonian chief of defense, who said, if I go, I'm not going to see anything.
When was that?
Oh, that was 2000.
In 2000.
2000. So this story came from 2000. So I had to go to the Finns and actually say, look, this is a load of nonsense. I've not been PNG'd. On the contrary, people are actually asking me to do stuff, to do this and do that. Can I write this? Can I write that? In fact, I went back and worked in Estonia in the Ministry of Defence in 2006 as a sort of like management advisor. So nobody was PNGing me. But this story kept coming up from people in places like Bulgaria.
Wow.
And Slovenia and Poland. And so I'd talk to someone and they'd say, I hear you were PNG. I say, well, how do you possibly know that? So it's on a line of, and that was just one of many similar sort of lines that you would read, not just about me, but just about NATO, and they were so common that after a while, it helped us recognize who was working for Russia.
It's fascinating what you're talking about.
They were giving themselves away, so we could actually write the names down. We could write the names down. The problem was, in many cases, embassies didn't want to know. Our embassies, that was one thing. And secondly, that those people had been to either America or Britain or somewhere else to do training. So they'd actually been on programs in our countries, and we've been training them. So we were on, a double whammy there. And the prime example, of course, is the president of Bulgaria and the last defense minister of Bulgaria, both of which are now are in the Communist Party. And the defense minister of Bulgaria has just been sacked because he refused to say this was war. And they've been arranging the maintenance of the Bulgarian aircraft with Russian companies and paying Russia to maintain NATO aircraft.
Wow.
So
you know what, Glenn? What you're saying is incredible, because the one thing that I think this war did, let's say the continuation from what was going on in Donbass, is it pretty much anyone who was related in some way or aiding or whatever, either an asset, whatever it is, for the Russians has come out in the clear. We can see exactly who they are, right now.
Yeah, not all of them. Not all of them. There's still some undercover. There's still some, but I think that the systems, I think that hopefully our security systems, and remember, some of the security systems themselves have been infiltrated. So, and include, the Ukrainian had, but the good guys in the Ukrainian system are fighting back. But
also in Germany as well, Glenn.
Germany as well. Yeah.
Germany has a problem.
There's more to come. There's more to come from this. France as well. There's more to come from this. These things, some of these things hopefully will come to the surface in due course. But then we're going to find that we were infiltrated probably 10 times more than we even could have imagined. Right across the board. That money has bought people everywhere.
Exactly. All of the political, economic,
and that's the hybrid warfare. The hybrid warfare is not little green men. Hybrid warfare is money buying political, and stopping proper procurement and buying things that you shouldn't be buying, because that's as important for messing up a defense system almost as the war.
Yeah, Glenn, can I ask you something?
Yeah,
can I ask you something? This is unique. I'm really, really curious about this. The Russians are really good at hybrid, at non-kinetic. Why? Why, if things were going, if they had gone forward, governments could have fallen. They invested so much in certain countries, right? Key countries. What tripped them? What tripped Putin in the end? Because this
I don't think he was tripped. I don't think he ever thought any differently. And remember that when he came in, the general staff, because I said to you, the general staff were already hate-filled, because they believed that they were all powerful in the Soviet Union, and then everything was messed up, and then they became Little Russia, and so I think that the military complex has always been hard up behind the politicians, on the conceptual side of how we go through this. But I don't think Putin needed tripping. I think he came in with maybe 1 week or 2 weeks to see what whether we were going to do it. And I think he just misread the signals. I think he misread. He didn't understand that anything that the West was doing was not based against Russia. It wasn't against Russia.
I know. Yeah.
It was just what we were doing, and we were quite happy with dealing with Russia. NATO Council, bring them in, have fun, come to our ski competitions. We invited them to competitions, we invited them to championships and things. We wanted them to come. And they didn't.
Yeah.
They didn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because by then the general staff would not let them do anything. Wouldn't let them.
Sorry.
No, go, sir. Go.
No, I was going to say, it is true that, if for years the signals that, that NATO and most European countries have been giving is like, we're not going to be serious about this. We're not taking this seriously. So we, it's, in a way, it's unsurprising that on the other side, the impression was they're not going to take this seriously. They're going to react the same way they reacted with in 2014.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
I mean, and Putin just judged weakness everywhere.
Yeah.
Which, as we've seen the last couple of weeks, there is.
Yeah.
In lots of places.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the German turnaround is well, it's not completely there yet.
No, not yet.
But it's a start.
It is.
Hopefully.
It is.
Hopefully.
So, Glenn, you think it's more the idea that it's timing? This was the best time to do this.
For them,
with something like that of the attack.
That's a good question, actually. I think it's timing to do with as much to do with Putin's health as anything else.
Interesting.
And that I think you're right. I mean, in some ways, that he senses a weakness or sensed a weakness around the system, especially with. I mean, I think that when Biden turned those 2 American ships round, went into the Bosphorus. I can't remember the date of that, but the moment he turned those 2 ships around,
it was in May.
War was fundamentally going to happen. That was it. And I said, the day he did that, I said, we're at war. It's only a matter now which day it is.
Yeah. I can't remember, but you're exactly right, because I remember that moment. And I was talking to Olga, and she said, "That's it." She said he turned the ships around. This was really bad. We were doing an episode on something, and she just said, "That's it. He's going to go forward." Yeah. They should not have done that.
No, it was an invitation to come and hit me. It's the cowards, the bully and the coward, and it was so sad. I have to say, I was nearly in tears when I heard that. Tears of frustration and everything else, because I knew then that I knew exactly what was going to happen, and and it did.
And also now the genocide, Glenn.
Yeah, that's even worse. I mean, there's a level of nastiness in there that I said that we haven't. I'm going to say we've forgotten, but you have to remember. I mean, he did the same in Georgia, but it never became public.
Yeah,
in Georgia. I mean, there were people. I'm reading about one guy had his hands cut off.
Yeah,
and things in Georgia. I mean, so we should have been warned. Really, I mean, Georgia was, they were nasty in Georgia, so we should have actually realised that what we were dealing with, it wasn't just about fighting a war. It was about punishment.
No, it's like punishing and obliterating.
Obliterating, getting rid of.
Never really accepted to them. Ukraine doesn't exist.
It's almost like this, the sort of the squashing of a cockroach, sort of attitude. Get rid of it. You don't care about it. No, absolutely no respect for human life at all. But they have no respect for human life at home. And if you don't at home, you don't when you go somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you treat your soldiers in that way, how you expect to treat.
Exactly. What do you expect them? Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what you used the word before that's perfect, the horde, because that's what it is. That's what we're talking about. Okay, Ludovico, you want to wrap it up maybe with a question?
To wrap it up, I mean, I was before this interview was rereading your article from 2018, the one how Ukraine can build an army to beat Putin, and in that article you spoke at length about many of the subjects that then you mentioned at the beginning of this interview in terms of reform. But I think the one thing is that you were very, I think, accurate and prophetic to an extent in terms of what was going to happen, and you clearly said this is not just about what's happening in Donetsk and Luhansk and in Donbass. This is we have to prepare for like a large-scale offensive, and an offensive that's not just against Ukraine, it's against the West in general. I know it's a tricky question right now, but it's like, how do you see this moving forward?
That's a good question, and it depends completely upon I think upon the individual bosses of countries, because NATO's stepped out of it. NATO, the current boss of NATO, he's a wimp, and he's got no courage whatsoever, and he shouldn't be there. We should have got rid of him and put Grybauskaite in, and actually put someone who got some courage. But Boris is taking a step forward. Czechs have taken a step forward. Germans are beginning to take a step forward. So I think that there's a gradual realization that something's got to happen. That the problem is much more complex than that. In that, all those weaknesses that I said before, a lot of them still exist. So there are weaknesses in. I mean, there's almost no manpower management, for example. And so if you're actually going to create something that is going to keep fighting Russia for maybe another 2 years or 3 years, which is where it goes, then all the countries have got to understand this, that it's going to go on, and they've got to stay the course. Because if we don't stay the course, it's going to come back worse. So I mean, I've already said that Zelensky asked for 1% of people's budgets. No, minimum is 10% for starters. People should be thinking about what 10% of everything we've got we need to give to Ukraine now, because if we don't, it's going to be 10 times the defense budget for every country. And not only that, all the cost of if he starts to throw missiles at Berlin or anywhere else, the disastrous effect of refugees in countries that are already holding refugees. I mean, he's managed to shift how many people? 4 million now out of Ukraine, at least, if not more, and every day more. So what happens if he decides he's going to hit Finland? Are we going to get another 2 million out of Finland? Or somewhere else? I mean, those are not populated. Those are not highly populated, but Romania and Bulgaria, Bulgaria's got space. Romania is relatively. So if he starts hitting, across into Poland and Germany and things like this, then the whole of the European Union will be under the most immense stress, financially and politically and militarily. Stress beyond their belief. So we have to win this. We have to win this now.
Yeah,
we have to win it now. That they've got to think that 10% is a starter. Preferably moving towards 30-40% of the budget into Ukraine to allow those Ukrainian soldiers. But that means also training. It's not sufficient to just give equipment. You've got to train people. We've got to find some business people to train as colonels and things like this. Because if we don't, the Ukrainians will just run out, and then the horde will keep coming forward, because they'll find more horde. Horde is easy to find in Russia.
Yeah. Yes.
Horde is easy to find. Soldiers are more difficult. Horde is easy to find.
So you think that Russia has the capacity to keep this level of offensive going on for 2 or 3 years?
I think so, because they've got lots more ammunition, and they're not doing. I mean, if you're fighting as a horde, you don't need anything sophisticated. You just keep numbers.
Just the hell out of them.
Kill, fire, and just keep moving forward.
Yeah.
And they've got all the Soviet Union ammunition. I bet you there's still a lot more stacked up back in Siberia. They won't have more precision weapons. Those will run out. Your cruise missiles will run out. But iron bombs, more old mortar bombs, old artillery shells, I bet there's a lot more stacked away than we know about.
They'll just throw it over. That's it.
And they'll just throw it over.
That's it.
Just keep throwing it.
Yeah. See, this is a big problem that we have here. I mean, Ludovico and I and here at Libri Oltre, Where in Italy, there's a very strong, at least on the legacy media, okay, there seems to be, and this is across also, for example, I don't know, in the UK, it's less. In France, we can see it. In Germany, we've seen it, although that's sort of turned around. The whole peace movement, peace at all costs, take away all their weapons, unilateral disarmament.
Yeah, all the nonsense things that
exactly
take absolutely zero account of Putin and the fact that he's backed up by a lot of people. I mean, I read it every day. When I read another one, it says, "Oh no, we should call a halt to the war." And you think, what world are you living in, mate? I mean, did you know, you're on another
Thanks,
planet.
Glenn. No, we have to fight this every day. It's
guys,
horrible.
I need to go because I've got another one on in 10 minutes.
Of course, I'll let you go.
No.
Thank you so much for coming. It was really great to have you, and I think we learned so much from this conversation.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much. Good question.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank
See
you so
soon.
much. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.